At 9:18 a.m. on November 8, 1942, Lieutenant J.G. Dale Fixit Corby was strapped into the jump seat of his Douglas R4D Skytrain, banking hard over the hostile coast of French Morocco. The air was thick with the scent of burning cordite and hydraulic fluid. Operation Torch had landed barely 24 hours prior, but the initial resistance from Vichy French forces had been far more coordinated, and their anti-aircraft defenses near the naval base at Port Lyoté were brutal. Corby wasn't a pilot in the traditional sense. He was the chief ordnance and maintenance officer for a hastily assembled, highly specialized utility squadron, the kind of men the regular U.S. Navy referred to, only slightly derisively, as the Scrap Metal Cowboys. Their R4D, nicknamed the Wrench, was a lifeline, ferrying critically specialized parts, magnetos for damaged P-40s, high-pressure fuel injectors, and on this particular morning, a replacement radio stack, vital for coordinating the ground advance 20 miles inland. Corby was 24 years old, but his hands were permanently stained by engine oil, and he carried the weight of a man twice his age. He hailed from the vast, unforgiving oil fields of West Texas, where machines either worked flawlessly or they cost lives, and the concept of waiting for a proper replacement part was treasonous. The Navy had tried to wash the wildness out of him, insisting on rigid protocols and factory-approved solutions. Corby, along with most of his unit, viewed the service manuals as historical documents rather than rules. When equipment broke, they fixed it with whatever worked, often salvaged aluminum sheeting, stolen wire, or parts cannibalized from wreckage. These scrap metal cowboys weren't heroes plucked from flight schools. They were the enforcers, the enablers, the men who kept the front line operational using grit and pure unregulated engineering audacity. Suddenly, a massive deafening crack ripped through the Skytrain's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently, throwing Corby against his restraints. The cabin lights flickered, casting strobe shadows across the cargo netting filled with delicate equipment. "Flak hit! Starboard wing root!" yelled Chief Petty Officer Miller, the pilot, his voice strained through the throat mic. "We're hit hard. Control surfaces are sloppy." Corby instinctively unbuckled and scrambled forward into the cockpit. The Skytrain, designed for stability and hauling capacity, was now behaving like a wounded animal. At 5,000 feet, visibility was good, allowing Corby to see the jagged hole punched clean through the wing root just outboard of the main gear housing. It was ugly, but not immediately fatal. The pilot was wrestling with the yoke, his knuckles white. The aircraft was pitching 12 degrees nose down, trying desperately to dive, and simultaneously fighting a constant grinding roll to the port side. "What's the damage, Chief?" Corby shouted over the roar of the engines. "We took a 20 mil right through the works. It felt like it shredded the trim mechanism. I can fight the ailerons, but the trim tab cables are completely severed or jammed. I have zero control over the lateral trim. We are running on maximum counter trim, and it's barely holding us level. If I let go for 1 second, we're inverted," Miller explained, sweat pouring down his face. The reality was simple. The aircraft was critically damaged and fundamentally unbalanced. A sustained, forceful exertion required to keep the plane level was unsustainable, both for the pilot and the structure of the R4D. They were only 15 minutes from the temporary landing strip, but 15 minutes of constant punishing strain meant the pilot would be physically exhausted, guaranteeing a catastrophic landing, or worse, the eventual fatigue failure of the main spar while they fought the relentless roll. Corby scanned the instrument panel. The gyro was struggling to hold true, and the airspeed was dropping rapidly as Miller fought the drag caused by the extreme control inputs. Standard procedure dictated an immediate bail out over the sea, avoiding capture by the French forces below. But the cargo, those magnetos, and the radio stack was priceless. Without it, the entire forward push risked stalling. Corby looked back at the gaping hole in the wing root, and at the access panel leading to the rear of the flight control cluster, located deep in the belly of the aircraft. He had two options: watch the pilot slowly lose control and prepare the parachute, or attempt a fix that was considered literally impossible by any conventional Air Corps mechanic. Repair the primary flight control mechanism, the delicate aileron trim cable system, while in flight, under combat pressure, with minimal tools, and through a hole barely large enough for his hand. It was a problem that required not a pilot, but a scrap metal cowboy. The airframe moaned in protest at the unnatural stress. At 9:25 a.m., Corby slammed his hand down on the metal bulkhead next to the pilot. "We are not bailing out, Chief. That radio stack is the nerve center for General Patton's advance. We fix it." Miller, his face grimacing under the load of the yoke, could only nod sharply. 15 minutes, Fixit. Maybe 20 before my arms give out. The air density is changing as we descend, and that roll is getting twitchier. Corby knew the arithmetic of fatigue. The lateral force required to counteract the damaged trim was monumental. The plane was currently flying at a severe, non-aerodynamic angle, crabbing through the sky to compensate. If Miller's strength failed, even momentarily, the R4D would snap into an unrecoverable spiral. The problem wasn't merely the severed cables, it was access. The trim tab actuator assembly was located inside the keel beam, shielded by 2 layers of structural bulkheads and the main spar web, making it almost inaccessible during routine maintenance, let alone in the air. The access panel, a small 4-bolt plate, was meant only for lubrication checks. Corby yelled a quick order to the radio man, Tech Sergeant Davies, who was busy securing the cargo. "Davies, get me the blue box, the salvage kit, and the 10-gauge structural wire, the stuff we pulled off the crashed Liberator." Davies didn't hesitate. The blue box was Corby's improvised, non-standard toolkit, a collection of field-modified wrenches, punches, and specialized hook instruments he had built himself. The structural wire was thick, multi-strand aircraft cable, usually reserved for secondary rigging, far too stiff for trim mechanisms, but robust enough to hold against 200 knots of airflow. Corby dropped into the cramped belly section of the R4D, just behind the main landing gear wells. The noise here was infernal, a cocktail of engine roar, wind rushing past the fuselage, and the occasional shriek of stressed metal. He located the small, square access plate, 18 inches by 18 inches, secured by 4 heavy-duty bolts. He retrieved his modified 3/8-inch speed wrench. The Skytrain dipped violently as Miller fought a sudden thermal current. Corby braced himself, his head knocking hard against an exposed beam. 9,000 feet, Fixit. We're starting our drop to 3,000 feet. Keep it steady. Miller's warning came through the intercom. At 9:35 a.m., Corby was working blind, relying on muscle memory to loosen the bolts. The compartment was hot, dimly lit by a single utility lamp and vibrating at a frequency that numbed the hands. Once the panel was off, the difficulty escalated exponentially. He was staring into a dark cavity filled with hydraulics, control wires, pulleys, and the main spar structure, a nest of essential components. The flak kit had obliterated the guide pulleys for the aileron trim, leaving the broken ends of the primary cables dangling uselessly. The tension that was supposed to keep the trim tab neutralized or adjusted by the pilot was gone. The air pressure acting on the damaged wing was now entirely dictating the tab's position, causing the violent, sustained pork roll. Corby needed to bypass the complex trim system entirely and essentially force the trim tab back to a neutral position, locking it there manually. This was a catastrophic engineering shortcut. If he secured the tab too far to the right, the plane would roll uncontrollably to the right. If his temporary rigging failed under high aerodynamic load, the plane would instantly become unflyable. He pushed his flashlight beam deeper. The cables had been cut approximately 3 feet into the cavity. He couldn't physically reach the ends with his hands, let alone manipulate the stiff replacement wire through the maze of other vital lines. "Davies, I need a tool. Bend me the longest piece of that wire into a hook, about 8 inches on the loop." "I need to fish those dead ends back out," Corby ordered. While Davies fabricated the makeshift grappling hook, Corby assessed his materials. He had the salvaged high-strength wire and his tools. But how would he secure the new wire to the old, broken cable ends in that confined, vibrating space? Standard splicing was impossible without specialized crimping tools and steady hands. Corby looked down at the pile of debris near his feet, flak shrapnel, insulation, and several small pieces of aluminum structure that had broken off the bulkheads. He spotted a piece of scrap aluminum, about 4 inches long and half an inch wide, thick enough to be structural. A wicked idea, entirely against every manual ever written, formed in his mind. He retrieved the hook wire from Davies. At 9:45 a.m., with the plane now dropping rapidly towards the 3,000-foot mark, the air becoming bumpier and the pilot struggling harder, Corby plunged his arm into the dark cavity, fighting gravity and the constant motion, ready to hook the severed cables that held the key to their survival. He was working not as a mechanic, but as a surgeon of scrap metal, deep inside the operational heart of the aircraft. The turbulence increased significantly as the wrench dropped below 4,000 feet, catching unpredictable air currents, whipping off the Atlas Mountains. The plane was shuddering, making Corby's intricate work a nightmare of microscopic precision against macro-level violence. At 9:48 a.m., Corby managed to hook the free end of one severed trim cable. He pulled it back slowly, inch by agonizing inch, until the frayed steel strands emerged from the dark tunnel. Now came the true challenge, securing the new structural wire to the old load-bearing line. The standard procedure for joining two cables under high tension requires a nickel-press sleeve and a large hydraulic press equipment 3,000 miles away. Corby had the heavy 10-gauge structural wire, but no way to join them securely, especially not in a way that would withstand the immense aerodynamic forces on the trim tab. Corby remembered a technique learned years ago, not from the Navy, but from his time rigging high-tension drilling lines on oil rigs, the Texas knot, a self-tightening choke knot designed for temporary but extreme load bearing. He meticulously threaded the new stiff wire through the broken loop of the old cable, weaving it back on itself 3 times. However, a knot, even the Texas knot, was prone to slipping under the continuous vibration of the R4D twin 1,200 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R1 830 engines. This is where Corby's survival engineering philosophy, the core of the Scrap Metal Cowboys legend, took over. He reached for the piece of scrap aluminum he had salvaged earlier, along with 2 small steel bolts and nuts from the blue box. Using the aluminum as a splint, he laid the newly knotted cable against the metal strip. Then, using a modified set of vice grips and a flathead punch, he carefully bent the edges of the aluminum scrap over the knot, essentially creating a rudimentary, non-standard clamp around the connection point. He secured this makeshift clamp with the 2 small bolts, using his speed wrench in the impossibly tight space. This aluminum patch, a piece of Vichy French shrapnel, or perhaps debris from a previous Allied wreck, was now structurally integrating 2 separate cables, forming a connection that violated every safety regulation in the United States military. But it was strong. It was solid. Starboard cable is secured and tensioned. Corby announced over the intercom. At 9:55 a.m., his hands were scraped raw, smeared with grease and minor cuts from the sharp edges of the bulkheads. Now he had to do it again for the port side cable, the return line, and then adjust the combined tension until the trim was perfectly neutralized, all while the plane continued to lean heavily to port. If he misjudged the length by even a quarter inch, the port roll would flip to an equally dangerous starboard roll, giving Miller no time to react. The second cable proved harder. The motion of the plane was actively sawing the port cable against a sharp metal edge near the main pulley housing. Corby had to work faster. He hooked the second cable, pulled it out, and performed the same intricate, illegal splicing procedure with another piece of salvaged scrap metal. At 10:05 a.m., both cables were linked by two crude aluminum clamps, rigged back through the pulley system and terminated at the actuator. Corby had to manually pull the new cable taut, using his entire body weight against the structural wire, forcing the trim tab back into a neutral, zero-deflection position. "Chief Miller, I need you to center the yoke now." "I'm locking the trim," Corby yelled. Miller, exhausted but focused, eased the tremendous counterforce he had been applying. The R4D, relieved of the strain, immediately threatened to spiral. Miller held his breath, praying Corby's geometry was flawless. Corby used a set of large locking pliers, sacrificing them permanently to the operation, to grip the cable where it passed through the terminal block. He cranked the tension nut down hard, compressing the cable against the block, locking the trim in the neutral position, dictated by his field measurements. He couldn't adjust the trim anymore, it was fixed, but the immense counterforce on the control surfaces was eliminated. The plane immediately stabilized. The severe cork roll eased. Miller's voice cracked with disbelief and relief. It's holding. The stick pressure is normal." "Fixit, you did it. How the hell did you anchor that thing?" "Improvised splice, Chief. It'll hold until we land, but don't touch the trim wheel. It's inert. We are flying a fixed-trim aircraft from here on out." At 10:10 a.m., the coastline was clearly visible. They were 5 miles from the makeshift landing strip near a captured lighthouse, running low, fast, and silent. They had neutralized the existential threat, but the ordeal was far from over. Corby scrambled out of the belly section, just as the sky ahead erupted in tracer fire and the distinctive thudding of a ground engagement. They had flown straight into the middle of a hot landing zone. The temporary landing strip at Port Lyautey was a dust bowl carved out of a scrub field, protected by a perimeter of hastily emplaced U.S. Army infantry. The air was chaotic. At 10:12 a.m., as Miller began his final approach, an artillery battery, identified as a captured French 75mm gun, opened fire from a dense grove of olive trees 300 yards south of the runway threshold. "Contact! We've got incoming near the approach path," Miller shouted, pushing the throttles forward to abort the landing. The R4D, flying at 170 knots, was now exposed, a slow-moving target on a predictable trajectory. The first shell exploded 50 yards off their starboard wing. The fixed trim system meant Miller had zero tolerance for error or evasive maneuvers. Any sudden, aggressive movement could snap the structurally compromised wing or overload Corby's field-rigged splices. They climbed steeply to 1,500 feet, flying directly over the entrenched enemy position. Corby grabbed a rifle and watched the ground below. The priority was still the cargo, the radio stack, which needed to be delivered immediately to the forward command post. They could not spend precious fuel and time circling the flak. Miller had to make an impossible decision. Option 1, attempt a high-speed approach from the sea, where they risked heavy flak from naval defenses. Or Option 2, attempt a radical low-level approach over the enemy's main artillery line, using the terrain for cover. Miller chose the audacious route. "We're going in low, Corby. I need to be below 100 feet to avoid the main battery. Prepare for a zero-flap, high-speed landing." A zero-flap landing in an R4D is brutally hard under ideal conditions. The lack of flaps means a higher approach speed and a much longer, faster rollout, increasing the chance of overrunning the short, temporary runway. With a damaged wing structure and fixed trim, it bordered on suicidal. At 10:18 a.m., Miller brought the wrench down, skimming the desert scrub at 180 knots. The ground rushed past in a blur. They were flying just 40 feet above the tree line, directly over the heads of the artillery crew. The French troops, startled by the low-flying behemoth, momentarily ceased coordinated fire instead resorting to small arms and heavy machine gun bursts. The sound of rounds puncturing the aluminum skin was immediate and visceral. Corby heard the thwack-thwack of bullets tearing through the fuselage behind him. Davies, the radio man, screamed as a round shattered his console, spraying sparks and dust. "Davies, status." Corby demanded. "The radio, it's dead. But I'm okay. Just scraps." The plane was taking damage, but the low altitude was effective against the main 75mm battery. Miller fought the remaining vibrations, using the full rudder inputs to compensate for the crosswind. At 10:21 a.m., they were over the runway threshold. The landing strip looked impossibly short. Miller had to burn off speed fast. "Brace, Corby. This is going to be rough." Miller dropped the gear, which slammed down with a metallic clang. He flared the nose violently, sacrificing speed for angle, and hit the dirt runway at a blistering 100 knots, 20 knots faster than regulation. The wheels screamed, throwing massive clouds of North African dust. The plane bounced once, twice. The tail wheel slammed down hard. Corby gripped the bulkhead, praying the patched wing root would hold the immense strain of the high-speed impact. The speed was too high. They were rapidly chewing up the short runway, hurtling toward the ditch at the end. Miller hit the brakes hard. The plane yawed slightly, the fixed trim forcing a constant, minute correction from Miller. But the landing gear held. The wings held. The scrap metal clamp held. At 10:23 a.m., the wrench slid to a dusty, violent stop just 10 yards from the perimeter ditch, battered and riddled with new bullet holes, but operational. Silence descended, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant rumble of the ground war. They had flown a critically damaged plane, fixed mid-flight by improvised junk through heavy flak, and landed it under fire. A jeep filled with infantry medics, and a colonel immediately raced towards them. Corby, shaking off the adrenaline, grabbed the carefully packaged radio stack and began securing it for transfer. The mission was complete. But the real story of the Scrap Metal Cowboys was just beginning to unfold on the dusty North African runway. Want to know the fate of Lieutenant Corby as impossible repair, and how this unit's reputation grew to become legend across the Mediterranean theater? Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover it. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories. Back to the wrench and the legacy of the engineering mavericks. The engineers who swarmed the wrench at 10:35 a.m. were stunned. They found the R4D's starboard wing root looking less like a combat aircraft and more like a jury-rigged farm machine. The two crude aluminum-clad Corby's shrapnel splices were holding the primary trim cables taut. The cables themselves were deeply scored where they had passed through the rough edges of the bulkheads, a testament to the immense forces they had resisted. When the maintenance chief demanded to know who had performed the illegal, non-standard field repair, Corby simply presented the two pieces of scrap aluminum, still bolted tightly around the Texas knots. The maintenance chief, a by-the-book Navy commander, could only shake his head. He calculated that the temporary fix had resisted over 500 pounds of aerodynamic pressure during a high-speed landing approach. The official report noted the repair was a gross violation of standard procedure, yet functionally effective, saving the aircraft, the crew, and the critical cargo. The legend of Dale Fixit. Corby and the Scrap Metal Cowboys grew exponentially after Operation Torch. They became the go-to unit for every impossible repair in the North African theater. Their reputation wasn't built on heroic flying, but on their ability to make anything fly tanks patched with tank parts trucks, running on stolen fuel and fighters returning from impossible odds, thanks to unconventional engineering solutions performed with grease, ingenuity, and junk. They demonstrated that the true genius of survival in World War II often lay not in mass production, but in the individual audacity to break the rules when death was the alternative. Corby continued to serve throughout the Mediterranean and into Italy, earning a Navy commendation for ingenuity and bravery, never for following the manual, always for rewriting it under fire. He ensured that the spirit of the Fixit squad, the belief that a broken machine was merely a challenge for improvisation, remained essential to the Allied war effort. These men were the unsung backbone of the logistical fight, proving that sometimes a piece of scrap metal and a wild idea were more valuable than $1 million factory part. Lieutenant Corby survived the war and returned to the oil fields of Texas, where engineering resourcefulness was a way of life, not a military anomaly. He carried the scars of the wrench, the lesson that necessity truly is the mother of invention, especially when you are 5,000 feet in the air and the enemy is shooting back. If this story of raw ingenuity and battlefield survival moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're rewatching from and whether anyone in your family served in World War II. You are part of the reason these men aren't erased from history. Dale Corby and the Scrap Metal Cowboys paid the price. All we're asked to do is remember their sacrifices and the impossible feats they accomplished so that future generations could live in freedom. By watching, liking, and sharing these stories, you're helping make that happen. Never forget,